I know we live in 2020, and a lot of people like to use programs like SketchUp or Fusion 360 to design their projects. But I'm old school, and to me, there's no substitute for good old fashioned pen and paper. When I'm designing a job, I grab my graph paper, my pencil, and I get drafting the old way. Sure, I might have some unorthodox methods, and I might not really know what I'm doing, but somehow, in the end, everything turns out alright. A lot of times, it's just hard to replicate this level of accuracy with a computer program. I find that you're missing the fine details, as well as the human touch. I started this bench with a nice piece of 8/4 black walnut. I jointed one face to get a smooth side so I could run it through the planer and even everything out. Once it was through the planer, I'll bring it back over the jointer and get a square edge. Obviously, this will be to bring it to my table saw and rip all the pieces down to their desired width. Unknown to me, this piece of wood was really twisted, and after I spent all that time milling it up and then ripped it down to these 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch pieces, they were so warped I couldn't even really use most of them. I was able to salvage a few pieces and cut and remill some of the longer ones for the legs. I then had to improvise and take this piece of 4/4 walnut and make some new stringers for the top of the bench. I cut it to a rough width on my table saw, then brought it over the jointer and did a quick edge joint. Once I had that straight side to reference off of, I brought it back to the table saw and cut it down to 2 inches, which would be its final width. Remember I said I was going to salvage some of that 8/4 that was all twisted and warped? Here I am cutting a couple pieces to 18 inches to make legs for the bench. The original piece was 7 feet long, and although the warping and twisting was pretty bad over 7 feet, when I cut the pieces down to 18 inches, they were pretty straight. So with minimal milling, I was able to salvage those and make legs. To join the leg pieces together, I decided to go with dowels. It's the fastest and easiest method that I have. Here I am with everything dry clamped together and just marking where I want to put the dowels and also marking all the pieces so I don't lose track of what goes where when it comes time to glue everything together. Next comes the pain in the ass of marking and drilling all of the dowels. I find it really annoying having to mark and drill all these holes, and eventually I plan on getting a Festool domino. But it's not in the budget right now, so I gotta suck it up and use this caveman method. Once I had all the holes drilled for the dowels, I decided to sand everything down before I assembled it, especially the parts that are going to be facing the inside. It's always easier to sand before you put stuff together, because then you don't have to worry about corners. With everything sanded, it's time for the glue up. I'm obviously using Titebond glue, but more specifically Titebond 3. Titebond 3 has a longer open time, or the amount of time that you have to work with the glue until it starts to set. Titebond 3 sets in 8 to 10 minutes, versus Titebond 1, which is only 4 to 6 minutes. Therefore, you have almost twice the amount of time to get everything put together and in clamps. Titebond 3 is also waterproof, so if I decided to move this bench outside, I wouldn't have to worry about the glue joints getting stressed if there was any excess moisture on them. That won't be an issue here though, because this bench was specifically designed to fill a space in the entryway of my house. Once the legs were assembled and I had to wait for the glue to dry, I decided to go and start cutting all the little slats for the top and bottom shelf. I had already cut up some pieces and milled them down slightly to about 24 inches for another project. And since I never started that project, I just started cutting them up to use them for the slats for this job. All in all, I had to cut about 90 slats, which took me forever. It was probably about an hour and a half to cut them all, and then once they're all cut, I brought them over to the jointer and jointed one face and one edge of each of them, as you'll see next. This part took even longer than cutting them. It probably wasn't even necessary, but I did it anyway. As you can see, I'm marking the face that I jointed. That way, I know exactly which way to face them when I now run all 90 pieces through the planer to get them down to about a half an inch of final thickness. With all the slats milled down, I then finished the sanding on the legs once they were out of clamps and sanded off all the glue that squeezed out on all the joints. Then I decided to take my cordless trim router and round over all the edges of the legs to really soften everything up and give it a nice visual appeal. I went with an 1/8 inch round over because it's one of my favorite bits to use. Once I rounded everything over, I had to take a sharp chisel and carry the profile into all the corners because the router bit can't reach them. But with a little bit of chiseling and some sandpaper, you can make everything look nice and seamless. Next, it was time to drill all the dowel holes for the stringers. I'm using the 4/4 pieces that I cut down to 2 inches for the top, and a couple of salvaged 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch pieces for the bottom. Gluing this up was a real pain. It would have been nice to have a second pair of hands, but I didn't, so I just had to suffer through it. I would attach one side and then attach the other, and then when I went to the opposite side and I moved everything apart, it would just fall apart on me. But once I managed to get it together, I used these ratcheting corner clamps from Harbor Freight to pull everything tight. This bench is 7 feet long, and the longest parallel clamp I have is 6 feet. I haven't gotten around to cutting any pipe clamps yet, so I had these laying around, decided to try them out, and they worked pretty great. I had to extend them a little bit with a piece of mule tape because the straps were only 15 feet in length. Once it was all glued together and I was waiting for that to dry, I went to the table saw and started cutting all these slats down to their final width, which was 1 3/4 inches. Once all the slats were ripped down, I then brought them all to the planer and made pass after pass after pass after pass until they were all milled down to about a 1/2 inch final thickness. With everything milled down, I went back to the chop saw, set up a stop block, and cut all the slats down to 16 inches. Once all the slats were cut, I clamped them all together and sanded them in 2 batches. I believe this is a lot faster than doing them individually and a lot easier. Sanding all the way up to 180 grit. I'll be finishing this with Rubio Monocoat Pure, which is an oil wax, and you don't need to go all the way to 220 when finishing with Rubio. I sanded all the faces in a similar fashion by clamping together. Then once everything was sanded, I went over to the router table and, you guessed it, used an 1/8 inch round over to round over the top side of all the slats to make it match the legs. This is another task that took forever. Once they were all rounded over, it was time to start finishing. I took my Rubio and I mixed it in the proper ratio of 3 parts of the oil to 1 part of the accelerator. When I'm measuring out the Rubio, I like to use a plastic syringe because they're all pre-marked and it's easy to get your ratios right. You can pour it into a measuring cup, but it's a lot easier just to use the syringes. I buy them on Amazon, they're really cheap. Use them, then just throw them out. It's also a good idea to wear gloves when you're handling the Rubio because it is an oil-based product and it'll just make your hands gross. Rubio is really easy to apply. Just pour a little bit on, or wet your Scotch-Brite pad and then apply it, and just rub it into the material. Once I have the piece coated, I'll put it on top of this board I made with all these nails to kind of hold it off the table while the Rubio sinks into the wood for a little bit. Then I'll grab another piece and start that one. Once the first piece has a couple minutes to absorb the Rubio, I'll then buff it in with a separate white Scotch-Brite pad. And once I buff it all in, I'll wipe off the excess with a clean terry cloth towel. Now it's ready to put on the drying rack and dry for a couple minutes. The cure time is 7 days if you're using the accelerator. It'll be dry enough to touch after 1 day, but you're not supposed to have any heavy use for 7 days. If you don't use the accelerator, then it's going to be a 30-day cure time. Here I am applying the Rubio to the base after I've done all the slats. This is going to be the same process. Put it on with a Scotch-Brite, buff it in with another Scotch-Brite, then wipe it off with a rag. The next day, once everything was dry, it's time to assemble the bench. Here I use 1 1/2-inch slats as a spacer, and then place the slats next to it and nail them in with a 23 gauge pin nailer. The 23 gauge holes are so small they're barely noticeable, so you can do it after finishing the piece and no one's really going to see them. So I just went piece by piece, using 1 slat as a spacer and then nailing the next ones in. until all 90 were done, top and bottom. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks again.